My name is Kim Metcherson, co-dean of Rutgers Law School in Camden, and this is The Power of Attorney.
I am extremely excited. I know I say that all the time, but this time I really, really mean it. Extremely excited to have on the podcast with us today Professor Mira, and she is a professor of law at Thomas Jefferson School of Law, although she's been visiting at UC Davis for the last couple of years. And she's also director of the Law School Survey of Student Engagement, as well as the author of a book called Unequal Profession, Race and Gender in Legal Academia. Mira was going to visit us at Rutgers Law School this spring and do a book club for us and also do a talk for the community about her book. Unfortunately, because of the current global pandemic we are all experiencing, she wasn't able to make that trip. And so this will pale in comparison to the actually being able to be in the same room with you, Mira. But I'm so glad that we're going to get to have this conversation and share it with folks either way. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. I'm excited we could make this work.
Absolutely. So I want to dive into the book, obviously, because it's completely fascinating and raises so many important issues about legal academia and how it's structured and how people become faculty and what it means for our students. But I want to start a little further back, if you don't mind, which is, one of the things that you talk about in your book is that for so many women of color, becoming a legal academic is sort of an accident. I would love to hear you talk about your road to becoming a lawyer, and then to deciding that legal academia is where you wanted to start to finish out your career.
Well, I definitely fit into that example of being an accidental law professor. My path to being a lawyer was more straightforward. I knew from a very early age that I wanted to be a lawyer. And I think by that, I mean that other people told me that I should be a lawyer. I argued a lot as a kid, and my great grandfather on my mother's side was a lawyer in India. At a time when, being a lawyer was much more about freedom fighting. So I had heard stories about lawyers because my great grandfather had worked with Mahatma Gandhi and was a friend and collaborator. And so my understanding of what it meant to be a lawyer, not just as a child, but probably through high school and even somewhat into college, was that being a lawyer was about social justice and about protecting vulnerable communities and fighting for freedom or for rights. And so I expected early on that I would go to law school eventually and practice as a lawyer, even though I really had no idea what law practice meant, especially not what it means for most people here in the US.
Mm-hmm.
And that's what took me to law school initially.
Okay. And I'm going to interrupt for 1 second, and then I'll switch to the legal academia question. What was law school like for you? Was it the experience that you expected it to be? What was it like being a woman of color in law school? And what were your experiences with the faculty there?
So I had a very unusual law school experience. I'm not sure I went into it with, particular expectations. I thought that I was smart and I would have to study hard, but I didn't really have a sense of what to expect from law school. My first semester at the University of Michigan Law School, the Grutter affirmative action litigation was filed against the undergraduate as well as the law school.
Mm-hmm.
And I joined a group of law students as well as some undergraduate students and even high school students and others in joining that case as an intervening defendant. And so my law school career really was defined in many ways by that actual litigation. So we were intervening defendants in the case. I was a member of the legal team. And so I was learning about the law while I was involved in a real way in really important litigation. We knew when that case was filed that it would eventually be a case litigated all the way up to the Supreme Court. And so I was really fortunate. I teach civil procedure now. I love civil procedure. I think it's a really exciting course and one that really ties students directly to the practice of law and really connects all of the other first year courses together. Of course, I didn't think about any of that when I was learning civil procedure, but it was an amazing opportunity to summarize depositions from these key experts for the Grutter litigation while I was learning about what a deposition is.
Right.
So a really incredible way to be involved in the law, to be really engaged with it while I was learning sort of the basics of the actual substance and the procedures.
What an amazing experience to have had as a law student. That's really wonderful. And I imagine, as you say, that it was something that really sort of shaped your understanding of who you wanted to be as a lawyer and the power of being a lawyer. I do want to back up a little bit though for folks who don't know what Grutter was and how important it was as an affirmative action case in higher education. And I think people now, we've been talking about other sorts of cases that have come up, the Harvard case and other sorts of things that are happening. So obviously this is an ongoing issue. But can you just give a little brief synopsis of what was going on in Grutter and why it ended up being such an important decision once it went up to the Supreme Court?
Sure. So the Grutter opinion from the US Supreme Court came out in 2003. And that was 25 years after the Bakke case, which was a case from California that looked specifically at, the kind of the origins of affirmative action. And the Bakke case is the one that first signaled that focusing on educational diversity could be a reason to create an affirmative action program on a university campus. And so that case had been sort of contested over the years. And so when the Grutter opinion was decided in 2003, it was really the first opportunity that the Supreme Court could come back and really affirm the main tenets of the Bakke case, where the Supreme Court itself could say, yes, affirmative action is constitutional. Yes, one of the appropriate ways or reasons to support affirmative action for a university or a law school or any other public institution of higher education is because these schools support educational diversity as a method of powerful learning, as a way to lessen isolation and to further these vibrant classroom conversations, because we know that people from different backgrounds, when they're able to bring those backgrounds into the classroom and to share those experiences with one another, we know that that improves the learning environment for all students. And so in the Grutter case, the Supreme Court clarified that that was a worthy interest for schools and that affirmative action policies that followed those requirements were allowed. And so that was really what was at stake when I joined the Grutter litigation, which was a case that was filed by, officially it was filed by a white woman plaintiff, but of course she had a large structure and organization behind her suing to end affirmative action. And so she was a white woman who had applied to the University of Michigan Law School. She would have been in my class at the law school, and she was ultimately rejected. And so she filed this lawsuit arguing that the reason she was rejected is because there is this affirmative action program that is unconstitutional. And so her argument is that there should have not been an affirmative action program, and that that was the reason she didn't get in, and she should have instead gained admission to the University of Michigan Law School. So many of us found it really personal. I certainly did. I think she was part of her allegation essentially was that I took her spot, right? That many of
Right.
us students of color at the school got in and we shouldn't have gotten in, that she should have been there instead of us, that there was something not just unconstitutional, but unfair or improper about my being there instead of her being there. And so for me, that was a really powerful, it wasn't just exciting to learn about the law and practice law, but it was very personal as well, to fight for affirmative action, to fight for my spot at that school, and to fight for the opportunity for so many people, especially for women and people of color, to be able to have even that minimum access to higher education and to law school specifically.
Right. And I imagine that on one hand, being one of the defendant interveners and having that group of students of color who you were working with there, as well as the attorneys and all the other good stuff, that was really a nice way to forge probably a really close community bond. I wonder though whether there were other students at the institution at that time who were hostile, right? And who did sort of agree with the lawsuit and did feel like, affirmative action is this way of stealing spots from qualified candidates and handing them off to students of color in the interest of some amorphous sense of diversity. So I wonder if there were those sort of tensions in the school while you were there.
There were absolutely tensions, not just within the law school, but on the larger campus as a whole. And the University of Michigan campus is, not acres and acres of land, and the law school is pretty close to the main campus too. I mean, they're a block apart, and so everything is really connected. I'll say that when the lawsuit was initially filed, it was in, like I said, my first semester of school, and a lot of students were really vocal very initially about their interest in defending affirmative action.
Mm-hmm.
What was interesting is that, over the course of time, because this is in the lawsuit was filed in 1997. And so it, like I said, it really defined my entire law school experience. I graduated in 2000, and the Supreme Court case, the opinion wasn't out until 2003. So all of this took a long time, of course. And so
Right.
while a lot of students were strongly supportive initially, I would say the vast majority of students at the school were relatively apathetic. I'm not sure it really was on the minds of most of the students for most of the time, the 3 years that I was there. Even the students who were supporters of affirmative action, of course, you're deeply invested in your own law school education, and it takes so much time and effort just to focus on, getting the reading for torts done or working on the memo that you have to turn in for legal writing. And so, of course, the day-to-day sort of takes over. And, I think there were also many students who cared about affirmative action, but maybe, didn't want to invest a lot of their time or energy in supporting it. And then, of course, there were people, like you said, who were hostile. So there were a number of different things that we did as students, as the interveners. We had a day of action, for example, a couple different times where we had sort of experts come and taught ourselves as well. So we had like teach-ins where we would leave the regular school classroom and have these alternate forums to learn more about the issues that we cared a lot about. We had press conferences that got a lot of national publicity because, of course, this was sort of the battleground for affirmative action during the time. And, some of those had counter protests where there might be perhaps a smaller group of students, but that still got media attention for showing up and countering the work that we were doing to say that, we were taking their spots, or affirmative action was unconstitutional, or that we really didn't need to spend the time and energy because the university was also defending affirmative action. And of course, that took a lot of resources from the campus as well.
Right.
So I would say for sure there were people who mobilized against affirmative action. But, what was more interesting for me at the time and even after was how even those who were supportive of affirmative action, most people weren't willing to invest a lot of themselves or their time giving to support or defend it.
Absolutely. And I think, one of the things that we'll certainly come back to as we talk about unequal profession is the way in which often, whether it's students of color or faculty of color, are invested in these other sorts of movements or things that are important to them that can sometimes, take time away from what other students are doing, right? So other people maybe are just focusing on their classes, whereas you're fighting a lawsuit, right?
Right.
While you're in law school. And I think that's a sort of a theme that probably runs through a lot of our experiences as women of color in elite institutions.
I mean, one of the things that's interesting about that is, thinking about how much time I did invest working on this litigation, even while I was a law student. And, I agree that could have been time that I spent on classwork or in other ways that I could have been invested in the campus or the school. But for me personally, and I think for a lot of students, it did create a sense of community for me that really was
Mhm.
essential. And so ironically, even though I invested a lot of time there, I think in some ways it actually helped engage me more deeply in the school. And I don't know if I didn't have that or some sort of similar experience, that took a lot of my time away from reading or writing or doing the classwork that I was expected to do. I'm not sure I would have achieved the same outcomes ultimately. Having that as sort of a goal and having the opportunity to work on that as a student really, I think, helped me be more committed in all the other things that I was doing too.
Excellent. So let's switch gears a little bit and go back because I took us on a tangent from talking about how you became a lawyer, and then the second part of that was going to be how you became a law professor. So let's jump into how you became a law professor, and then we'll jump into the book. I understand why you went to law school, and then you had this amazing litigation experience while you were in law school, but then ended up as a law professor. So talk to me about that transition.
Yeah, so I graduated from law school in 2000, and my first job after law school was as the Brennan Fellow at the ACLU's National Legal Department in New York City. The ACLU's National Legal Department has two fellows, at least at the time, they had two fellows every year that worked sort of broadly with the legal department as a whole. And so that was my first job, and I worked primarily on cyberspace and First Amendment, large impact litigation. And it was a really exciting opportunity to learn about how to practice law in a really different way than I had with Grutter. The ACLU's litigation strategy was much more focused on sort of looking at national trends and identifying issues that were already or were going to be serious problems in various vulnerable communities. And so it was just a very different way of thinking about how to practice law and still be really invested in communities.
Mm-hmm.
From the
Mm-hmm.
ACLU, it was a 1 year fellowship. And then I moved back to California, where I grew up, to practice with the California Women's Law Center. And the California Women's Law Center is a statewide nonprofit that does primarily policy and advocacy work. And so it's an IOLTA funded institution. So not a lot of direct services, but rather sort of large scale policy work and working with communities, supporting other groups and legal services groups that did direct services. So we weren't necessarily filing a lot of lawsuits on behalf of individual clients, but we were supporting those organizations that did that. And so again, it was another opportunity for me to learn about a new way of practicing law, one that I really hadn't been exposed to. Of course, we did a lot of policy and, a lot of advocacy work in the Grutter litigation, but this was much more about, writing reports and meeting with community members, running a focus group to create materials in language for different communities, training trainers so that the work that I did had more of an impact, not just with an individual litigant or community, but that could be then taken to more communities and spread more widely. I was also more involved then in statewide legislation, just really anything that had to do with improving women's health, which was my primary focus. So I was the staff attorney for women's health and director of the Breast Cancer Legal Project. So I was there at the California Women's Law Center for a couple of years, and especially because I was so involved in different community work, I recognized that I really didn't have the skills that I thought were essential to being able to support the community in terms of research. And then if you remember back to the Grutter experience, one of the most incredible parts of that was that we had a number of national experts join our case. And by that, I mean volunteer their time to be experts for us during trial, for example. And so John Hope Franklin, the father of African American studies, was an expert for us. Eric Foner, a renowned historian, especially in terms of Reconstruction, was one of our experts. And so, I had the opportunity as a law student and as a new attorney to work with these experts. And that really gave me an insight into understanding more about the partnership or the opportunity, the potential for partnership between lawyers and academics. And so one of our experts for the Grutter litigation is Walter Allen, who is a national expert, a sociologist and professor of education at UCLA. And so, as I was finishing, I think my second year at the California Women's Law Center, I set up a meeting to talk with him about graduate school. And again, it was, I think because I had been exposed to these incredible national experts, and also because I felt like I didn't really have a methodological training, even though I recognized the opportunity for how that sort of research could really push things further in terms of legal advocacy. And so honestly, I picked sociology because I looked through a bunch of school department websites and tried to think of all the different many things that I was interested in. And sociology seemed like it covered a lot of different topics, whether it was race and ethnicity or gender or immigration or language. You could sort of study any of those things if you studied sociology. And so that's how I picked it. And so I took the GRE and then started my PhD program at UCLA. I kind of, went through this roundabout way of going to law school first and then practicing law and then going to graduate school and getting a PhD. I went on the teaching market. I actually looked at jobs in both law and in sociology. In spite of the strong community of activists and advocates that I was involved with in law school. Law school was not really, fun for me. It wasn't somewhere where I felt like I belonged and where I was really excited to return. I think
Yeah.
that is true for a lot of academics. For
Yeah.
women of color, especially, I think many of us didn't love law school. And so we kind of are uncertain about spending the rest of our professional lives in that kind
Right.
of environment. And yet, I know from the research that I've done with law faculty that there are white male faculty members who knew, even when they were in law school, that this was something they enjoyed so much and they hoped they could continue to do as an academic for the rest of their careers. And so I certainly did not feel that way. I had to be talked into a little bit, even applying to jobs in law schools. Jerry Kong, who's a faculty member at UCLA in the law school, is one of the people who famously told me, it's very different when you're the person at the front of the room.
Sure.
Because I had told him, I didn't love law school. I don't think that's where I want to end up. So he is someone, Devin Carbato, who's also at UCLA and a friend and mentor of mine, also someone who I think worked hard to help me understand that being a law professor would, perhaps give me a very different experience than my experience as a student.
Sure.
And that's
Absolutely.
how I ended up at a law school.
Yeah, it's so funny. I mean, so many, obviously, so many of the pieces of your story and then pieces of your research and your book resonate so deeply with me. And I remember having conversations with some of my colleagues who are, sort of in my cohort in terms of being law school professors. So other folks who are junior faculty, and talking to some of the white men who would say, I went to law school to be a professor, or I knew very early on in law school that I wanted to be an academic. And I was so confused by that, right? Like I couldn't imagine there were people for
Right.
whom that was a life path, because for so many, again, women of color, people of color in general, people who were first gen law school, the idea of being a law school professor just didn't even enter into our minds. And it had to be that somebody started steering us in that direction, or some sort of kind of divine intervention happened before we ended up in these jobs, which I think is one of the many interesting pieces from your book. So let's transition and let's talk about the book now. So the book, as I said before, is called Unequal Profession, Race and Gender in Legal Academia. Do you want to describe what the research is, what the study is that you did that produced this book?
Sure. The book draws from my study, Diversity in Legal Academia, which I call the DLA study. And so the Diversity in Legal Academia study is really the first formal empirical study to investigate the personal and professional lives of law faculty from all stages of the career, from all regions of the country, looking specifically at race times gender challenges as well as potential opportunities, but incorporating interviews as well as surveys, not only from women of color, and by that I mean Black, Latina, Asian American, Native American, Middle Eastern, and multiracial women, but also incorporating perspectives from white men, white women, and men of color in order to provide a comparative element to the study as well. And so the
Mhm.
book reveals findings from that study, and it sort of follows somewhat chronologically the trajectory of a law professor. And so there's an introduction, an introductory chapter to the book, and then the chapters themselves kind of follow the life of a law professor. So it starts with hiring. There's a chapter on interactions with colleagues, one on relationships with students. And then in addition, the book covers tenure and promotion as well as leadership for those like
Mhm.
you who have heeded the call. I also cover work life balance. And then there's a large chapter that sort of looks at various mechanisms of support, as well as individual strategies and broader structural solutions that can be used to address some of the challenges that are identified throughout the book.
Okay.
So, when my dad read the book, or parts of the book at least, and he said, "This doesn't really read like a regular law book." True.
Yeah.
It's very sociological, and it draws specifically from qualitative research. And so it is a mixed method study. So I collected survey data from almost 100 law professors, and then I followed up doing individual interviews with all of the people who participated in the survey portion. And the book sort of identifies patterns from that data and then shares the actual qualitative data, which is quotes from the individual participants. And so it's very conversational. It's much more
Mm-hmm.
about identifying ways in which there are similarities for particular populations or how there might be some differences, and then using the actual words of the participants in the research study to show what their experiences are like.
Right. And one of the things that I think is so terrific about it, I agree with your dad that it doesn't read like a sort of typical law book, which makes sense because your training is broader, but it also means that your work is really grounded in a way that a lot of law books are not.
Right.
And it's really sort of thinking very critically about the lives that these folks are leading and their lives in the law and their lives in law school, and how we can take that information and actually translate it into ideas and policies and concrete changes to the system that will lead to the kind of diversity that lots of people claim that they care about. And yet, when you walk into law school faculty meetings, you can see that what diversity means in practice and what diversity means in theory can be incredibly, incredibly different things. So I want to do a little bit of definitional stuff with you, because I think that there are concepts that you bring out in the book that are really important. And one of them is what you already talked about, which is this idea of race times gender, which of course is sort of rooted in the idea of intersectionality. And one of the things that I have found really challenging over the last several years, that I have just watched the word intersectionality get expanded in ways that are sometimes concerning to me. And by expanded, I mean, so in some ways, watered down.
Mhm.
So I would love to first hear you talk about and help people understand what intersectionality means at its core, at its root, and then how that plays into your concept of race times gender.
Yeah, so race times gender is a term that I created and use in the book and in other publications. And as you say, it is deeply rooted in intersectionality. So, intersectionality, in my mind, is about recognizing the ways in which particular individuals have these background characteristics that can combine and create sort of opportunities for oppression or devaluing. And so it's not so much just about thinking about your identity and how it might overlap, but thinking about particular parts of identity that tend to be devalued or tend to be more marginalized in society. So
Mm-hmm.
have less status, and how those can then be used to work against or push against people with those identity characteristics.
Mm-hmm.
And so, everybody is made up of many things, many identity characteristics. At the beginning of all of my interviews for the book, for example, I asked every participant to share with me their identity. When they think of the core of their identity, how do they identify? And I got a lot of people talking about being a mother or being a sister, being a professor. That came up a lot. And race and gender came up a lot as well. People who identify as being gay or lesbian or queer would often identify themselves that way, although it was very unusual for someone who was straight to recognize that and identify with that, because that's part of sort of what the expected norms are, right? And so it's not a devalued characteristic to be straight, and so people tend to not necessarily state it, notice it, or state it. Similarly, I did include people from different class backgrounds, for example, or people who were able-bodied as well as disabled, and it was maybe one or two people identified purposefully as able-bodied. I don't think I had anybody say that they were wealthy necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it sort of feeds into what you're saying in terms of the watering down of intersectionality. It's not just who are you and what are the different things that make up who you are, but thinking about the ways in which those different identity characteristics have particular types of status or privilege or power. Um,
Absolutely.
and so when I talk about race times gender, it's more thinking about the ways in which race and gender have compound effects. That's why there's sort of a multiplication sign in between the two. As a woman of color, I'm not just a woman plus a person of color, but there are compound things that create the community around me and also create the interactions that I have because I am both of those things. So it may not be, I may not fit squarely within whatever my gender background might be because, the women who often are the leaders or have power within women's organizations are white women. And so I'm not going to identify in all ways. We may have many things in common as women, and that certainly came through in the book. But there are still going to be differences based on race or immigration status or other characteristics that are a central part of my identity. And so the
Right.
race transgender term is to really highlight that point.
What I want to do now, Mira, is think some more about the book, particularly now that we have that background in thinking about, how you're using race times gender and that intersectionality lens to think about these issues about women of color in law schools. And as you said earlier, the book really sort of goes through each of those points of entry, becoming a law professor in the first instance, interactions with colleagues, dealing with students, tenure and promotion, and then finally moving into leadership and trying to create a balance between one's work life and personal life. And I don't want to steal the thunder of the book because people should buy it. So I don't want to go through every single detail, but I do think it's worth talking about some of the bits and pieces that come out in this book that I think are, one, really relevant, obviously, to women of color who are law faculty, but probably really broadly relevant to women of color at a lot of different types of elite institutions or institutions where women of color are a very small percentage of those who participate. So one of the things that I thought was particularly interesting in that chapter on collegiality and the interactions that folks have with their faculties was you made the point that a lot of white faculty members identify their relationships with faculty of color, particularly women of color, as being, relatively close and collegial and everybody gets along and it's all pretty great. And then you look at the faculty of color and their response, or their response rate about those relationships is very different. Can you talk about that a little bit, but also about what the impact is of having those different experiences, whether you're a white faculty member or a faculty member of color?
Sure. So, the book draws from both quantitative and qualitative data. And it's primarily qualitative data that I present in the book, which is made up of the actual quotes of the participants in the study. But I do also use the quantitative data, and that's the survey data that every participant shared that I use it sort of to frame the qualitative data in a lot of instances. And so this is one example of that, and one that I thought was especially powerful and was sort of surprising even to me as someone who's done this type of research for a number of years. And so, I asked every participant in the study to talk about the quality of their relationships with their colleagues. And I broke it down by race. So they could talk about, what it's like to interact with white colleagues, Native American colleagues, if they have any Latinx colleagues, right? People from different backgrounds. And as you said, the white respondents tend to have pretty excellent relationships with everyone, faculty from all different backgrounds. But then when faculty of color respond to that same question, I noticed that they characterize those same relationships slightly differently. And this is especially true for Black faculty members. And so to me, the impact of that, or what's really interesting about that, is that people understand the same relationships differently from their own perspectives. And so I'm not sure that what this means is that the Black faculty members are correct and the white faculty members are incorrect. It's not really about anyone being right or wrong. It's just about how people understand their own relationships. And so the ways in which white faculty members see their relationships with faculty colleagues from all different backgrounds is objectively, from their perspective, positive, right? So they think they have these great relationships with everyone. But then when I ask the Black faculty members about those same relationships, they don't see them as quite as in a quite as positive a light. And so that I think should give us a little pause, right? To think about the things that we see from our perspective is not necessarily true from everybody else's perspective. What's helpful about the qualitative data is that it gives us an opportunity to delve a little bit more deeply into those relationships. And that's true not just for this particular question, but for everything. I tend to think of quantitative data, survey data, as being really good at explaining what is happening. You just check a box and then it's pretty easy to map out particular responses. But it's really difficult to get at the more sophisticated questions about why things are happening. Whereas with qualitative data, you can really get more of the details of why certain things are happening, and you can hear about it from their own voices. And so, as you said, there's a chapter in the book that looks specifically at interactions with colleagues. And there, we see so many of the women of color in my sample talking about the challenges that they face with colleagues in terms of feeling silenced during faculty meetings, mansplaining that happens to white women as well as women of color. That was one of the most common examples that came through. Another really frequent pattern is in the book that I call, and others have called, heap-eating, which I did not make up that term, but I think it's just the perfect descriptor.
Absolutely, yeah.
So here's an example of heap-eating. This is from Carla, who says, I have counted over 10 times on my faculty where I've said something and nobody has responded. Then a male faculty has repeated it, and another male colleague has said, good idea. And so writing about that, I say heap-eating thereby provides weight, acknowledgement, and appreciation for men while devaluing women. So, even though it's these women's original ideas that some other person, a man, is repeating later on, the man is acknowledged for being this originator of this great idea, even though it was actually the woman's initial idea.
And I think one of the things that also comes from that and from this whole discussion that we're having is that there's an amount of emotional energy that goes into strategizing that a lot of women of color do. Some of it is just about the code switching that people of color do all the time as they move into different sorts of environments and sort of understand the parts of themselves that are welcome in some places and not welcome in other places. But it takes work to do that, right? To sort of put on these different kind of personas depending upon what environment you're in at any given time. And it seems to me that that's this other place where there's this layer of sort of emotional and psychological work that certain populations are doing, women of color in particular, in order to survive at these institutions, that takes some of their energy away that they could be using for other things, like their professional work. And instead, they're spending it trying to figure out, okay, should I say this in a meeting or not say this in a meeting? Should I suggest that one of my colleagues say it because I know it will be accepted more coming out of that person's mouth? All those sorts of calculations.
Right. In the book, I write about this as emotional labor because it is work, like you said, and it's uncompensated work that primarily women of color and some white women and men of color have to perform. And it is performative, right? So it's thinking about what is expected of me and how do I fit into these existing norms so that others acknowledge, at least in some way, that I might belong here. And this is especially difficult during the junior faculty years when you are still working towards tenure. And so, the emotional labor might be dressing a particular way that's possibly not, always the most comfortable way for a Black woman to dress, for example, right? Like looking the way that other professionals on campus expect her to look. Wendy Green and others have done a lot of amazing work on hairstyles and thinking about how natural hair is, or locks, or, other performative things come into play a lot. And this emotional labor has some interplay not only with regard to colleagues, which we've been talking about so far, but since you were asking about different chapters of the book, it certainly is really relevant with regard to interactions with students as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And that chapter is also really it's a little bit of a painful read to hear some of the stories of women talking about their interactions with students and how some of those interactions can be incredibly hostile and demoralizing.
What's interesting, and I didn't really put this paradox together until I had done this research, but I asked every participant in the study to talk about the best thing at their law school. What's the best thing about your experience working at your law school? And the vast majority of women in the sample, and especially women of color, talked about students. And I had, just over and over interviews with women of color saying students are the best part of the job. The best thing about my law school is the students. I love my students. I mean, just, that was the easiest section to write because I had so much material to pull from. Everybody talked about how great the students are. But on the flip side, there are, some really challenging environments or situations, especially in the classroom, that are created by students. And so, you might have 50 students in a class, let's say, and 48 of the students are really engaged, really excited, provide significant deference and recognize the authority of the woman of color professor at the front of the room. But if there are just one or two students who, regularly push back, who challenge that professor's authority, who begin with this presumption of incompetence, it really creates a difficult environment, not only for that one woman of color professor at the front of the room, but it actually makes a more challenging learning environment for all of the students, right? Because then some of that professor's energy has to be spent convincing those two students that she really is an authority in intellectual property, right? Or whatever the topic of the class might be. And, I've been in that situation myself, and I've been teaching for a dozen years now. And so I noticed that if I get pushback from one student, a dozen other students are rolling their eyes, right? So I recognize that it's not like all the students are against me, but I still have to expend some energy reminding that student that I'm the professor, that I'm the expert, right, in whatever topic it is that I'm presenting on. And so it's this very strange paradox, and it has really serious implications. Later in the book, there's a chapter on tenure and promotion, and the reason given for promotion or tenure denials that was most common in my research was student evaluations.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not just a question of, do I have to spend 5 minutes one day reminding the students that I'm in charge, but who's going to read these evaluations at the end of the semester, and how might that impact the long-term professional trajectory of this professor? It does
Absolutely.
have the potential for really serious consequences. It's literally derailed the entire professional career of multiple faculty members to have even sort of polarized evaluations, not necessarily all negative, but some really great ones and some that aren't as great, that can have serious consequences.
Yeah, and I think it really speaks to the importance of having, some strong voices in the room when you're having those discussions about promotion and tenure, and to have those people who say, let's talk about the problems with student evaluations. And let's talk about the data that shows us that women and people of color, and particularly women of color, tend to get much harsher evaluations, and the way that students, the kinds of things that students will write about in evaluations can be really different for female law professors. Everything from how you dress, the tone of your voice, all of those sorts of things become relevant in ways that are not true for professors who come from majority groups. And so I'd like to think that we're getting past that a little bit, but it still continues to be something that's really challenging. And if you don't mind, I did want to just read one quote from the chapter on interactions between faculty members and students. And it's a story by a Black female professor named Trisha. And she says, quote, "I had one student tell me once, and he thought he was being a friend. He said, quote, "I never had a Black woman tell me anything who wasn't dressed in white." Initially confused about what this meant, she says, "It took me a minute. I had to think about that. What do you mean dressed in white?" Then I realized that the roles he was assigning me were maid, nurse, and so on. And I thought that was such a powerful moment, right, to sort of recognize. And I've been in that position of having a student say to me, "I've never had a Black woman professor in all of my years of education until you." And so, these experiences that are in some ways incredibly unique to particular categories of people, and yet have an impact on how they are viewed by students in these really, really profound ways.
Yeah. I mean, that I remember that interview taking place, and I was speechless. I have also had students tell me that I'm their first professor of color, or they've never had a South Asian law professor, certainly. And for me, what was just especially awful about the experience that Trisha relayed to me was that the student wasn't politely just saying, you're my first Black female professor, or even saying with pride how happy they were to have a Black female professor, but sort of using it, I think, as an opportunity to try to put the professor in her place in sort of this weird race gender hierarchy. Even though the professor is obviously the expert with regard to the student, nevertheless, the student felt the need to say, I've had interactions with Black women before, and I was in charge, and they were there to serve me in a caretaking role. And so I'm not used to having someone who looks like you be seen as an expert or an authority. And so to me, that was not shocking in the sense that I know that that happens, but just what a truly awful experience to have to go through with the student who then is going to show up in class the next day, right? And write an evaluation of your teaching abilities at the end of the year that might be taken really seriously at the end of the term.
Right.
And
Right. And how do you as the professor relay to your colleagues these are the kinds of experiences that I'm having, and you have to keep those in mind, or should keep those in mind as you're looking at these evaluations. That's a difficult thing to do.
There's one short quote from a Latina in the sample that I thought was like just so perfect. And this is from Marisol, a Latina, who asserts, this is the quote, she asserts that an institution that will support you is one that will look at negative student evaluations and ask, do your evaluations suck because you suck as a teacher? Or is there something else going on? Right? So it is as simple as like taking a step back, right? And recognizing the evaluations may not contain all the answers, right? We shouldn't
Right.
necessarily blindly accept everything that's in here as some sort of objective truth.
Right.
And so I think just like you're saying, having that person in the room to say, well, let's take a minute to really ask ourselves what these evaluations are assessing. And that can be just so effective and useful for junior scholars, especially.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I want to skip ahead a little bit in the book and to talk about leadership, because we are at this incredible moment in the legal academy in terms of diversity in deanships. So certainly more Black women than we've ever seen as law school deans. I'm pretty sure more women in general. So many women who are first at their institutions, the first woman of color to be the dean at an institution, more men of color as well who are deans of law schools. So on one hand, we're at this time where law schools were already sort of struggling even before the pandemic that we're dealing with now. And, in your book, you sort of talk about being at this moment of disruption in law schools, and that being a time where we can really start to think about, all right, well, how do we reconstruct law schools, including thinking about diversity and thinking about how do we make a law school environment where lots of people are comfortable and where lots of people can flourish. It seems to me that we're at another moment of disruption at this point where we've got, all of these things that have changed so quickly in law schools, switching to remote learning within the space of a couple of weeks for most of us, sometimes less than that, changing our grading systems, reevaluating how we're going to use student evaluations because of those changes that have been made, rethinking the bar exam, at least temporarily. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how you see this other moment of disruption that's taking place, and the impact that you hope, in good ways, that it might have on legal education.
Yeah, thank you for that question. It is remarkable that there are so many, especially as you said, Black women stepping into deanships. In my research, when I asked about interest in pursuing formal administrative leadership positions, most of the women of color in my sample were very clear that they were not interested at all. So, like, the most common pattern there was some version of like, oh no, I never want to be that came up a lot.
Exactly. Yeah.
And, I could have just left it at that, but then I sort of probed more to get again, at the why, which I can do with qualitative data. And it turns out there are a lot of structural roots there. So a lot of the lack of interest comes from a recognition that they may not be supported in those roles, given the lack of trust and, sometimes even animosity, just even when they're a regular colleague on the faculty, let alone, when they're in a position of power. And so having that support seems to be key. And I start the chapter on leadership with the example of a Black woman named Michelle, who was considering, after being encouraged by multiple people, to apply for a university-wide position at her school. And Michelle, this is what I write about her. She credits her white male dean as, quote, the biggest factor in her decision to apply since, and here's what she says, he several times said to me, you know, I really think this is something you are uniquely situated for. And I will do everything in my power to help you succeed once you're in it. And so I think that's really the key. In the book, the book was published last year, and there was the explosion of Black women stepping into these formal leadership positions had already begun, and it has only continued over the last year, which is really an exciting thing to witness. I tempered that excitement a little bit in the book, just, because I'm a little bit nervous to see what that support will look like and what the positions will be. Will there be some sort of feminization of the position of dean, where it's
Mm-hmm.
less about being a visionary and more about sort of the menial tasks of scheduling or coordinating or arranging things? I hope not. I really hope that it's remains this sort of big, exciting opportunity to make really constructive change. And so this is where the second part of your question, I think, really fits in. Who knows what would have happened, without the global pandemic and the crisis that we're all enduring now? But it's here, right? And so in the book, I write a lot about not just the challenges facing women of color faculty, but thinking about how some of these differences might be opportunities too. And so I'm curious to think about the state that we're in as perhaps an opportunity as well, right? So we can think about that in a lot of different ways. Here we have hopefully one of the most significant challenges that any of us will have to face personally and professionally in our lifetimes, with not just the shelter in place orders, but with the increasing spread of the virus as a whole. And so because we're sort of forced into this horrible position, what are some things that are changing now that might not have changed otherwise? And, this might be things that seem small or big, but could have really lasting impacts. So I'm new to Twitter. I've been on Twitter, it's just my actual name, for not that long, just a year or so now. And so I've seen on Twitter, for example, people in the disability community who say, we have been trying to participate in conferences virtually for decades. And we've been told that it's impossible to do. And lo and behold, all of a sudden it's required and everyone can quickly manage to make it happen.
Exactly.
And so to me, I recognize that as an opportunity. Okay,
Yep.
yes, you've been telling able-bodied people for years that there should be this opportunity at least for others to participate, even for people with disabilities to participate, not even that all conferences should only be offered virtually. And now that we figured out a way to do it, is there really any reason ever to go backwards from this?
Right.
So if we have figured out a way to include Zoom or whatever in our conference, why would we ever no longer include it? Right. And so similarly, the UC system, for example, has said that they will not rely exclusively or potentially at all on standardized tests, so on the SAT or the ACT for this fall's admission or next year's admission, because they recognize that numerous testing opportunities have been canceled because of the pandemic. And so if they are saying, actually, we can make really meaningful decisions like admissions decisions, even if we don't have your SAT or ACT score right now, what would be the need then for them to have to rely on the SAT in 2022?
Sure.
And so I'm trying to think of this as an opportunity, as a way that we can think of ways to be more inclusive, that we can try to expand diversity even further. And, when we think about diversity, and often when people write about diversity, which I've done as well for many years, a lot of the focus tends to be on recruitment. And of course,
Right.
Getting people in the door is not sufficient. If you get them in the door and they recognize they are not welcome and they don't belong and they are not engaged, they're not going to be as successful as they should be. So this, I think, is an opportunity for us to think much more deeply about that retention piece, both for students and for faculty or for, professions as well. Not just the legal profession, but for any field. And so if we can be more inclusive and we can quickly mobilize, using the available technology at our fingertips to create environments that can increase access for students to higher education or give opportunities for people who otherwise could not participate in conferences to join them, why would we not do that? Why would we not continue to do that going forward? And so, in that sense, I absolutely see this as a disruption that could have some positive consequences. I mean, this is at most a silver lining, right? I mean, obviously,
Right.
it's just a horrible situation that we're in. But, my hope is that coming out of it, there is an opportunity to learn some things and improve on what we've done before. Um,
Definitely.
what I am really nervous about, I will say, is thinking about how this may have really serious negative consequences for women professionals in many fields. So many of us are trying to work full time from home while also being the default parent and carrying the mental load and cooking meals every day. And a lot of us are sharing those responsibilities with partners. Some people are doing it on their own. But women traditionally and continuingly are the ones who are carrying most of that load at home. And so, it's really not sustainable long term. I don't know how long people will be expected to work their full number of hours at home while also homeschooling and, doing all of the other work that needs to get done if they're not getting equal participation from any other adult who might be in the house.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
I am really nervous about that. Even though I see this as a potential for a real positive, the biggest negative that I'm concerned about is how this is going to affect the trajectory of women professionals in every field going
Yep.
forward.
Absolutely. I do hope, as you say, that we can use this as a really positive moment. One, to recognize the number of things in our system that are either deeply flawed or broken. And then two, to say to people, don't tell me that there aren't things that you can do quickly. Don't
Right.
tell me that we're not capable of tremendous shifts when we choose or when we have to do that. And so I'm hoping that that's a lesson actually that we can continue to draw on and really force people to think about what are the positive things that can come out of this really turbulent and difficult time.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it's hard because part of what we're talking about is the disruption, right? So if men are stepping up to do more at home, or if there are male bosses who recognize that, like, okay, you're not going to be able to meet your hours at work. If you're a lawyer and a partner in a or an associate in a law firm, maybe the partners will recognize, okay, we can't really expect you to be home with children and actually get the same hours of work done. And so, maybe this is an opportunity for some of that to change. And
Yeah.
women to recognize that other people can step into those roles too. I mean, the data that I have from the law school survey of student engagement, for example, tells us that there are, really significant differences between how men and women spend their time, for example, even in law school. So 74% of women spend 5 or fewer hours exercising per week.
Mm.
Over half of women spend 5 or fewer hours engaged in any sort of social or leisure activity. And then, perhaps most disturbingly, a majority of women from the LESI data report that they spend 5 or fewer hours sleeping per night.
Ugh.
The challenging thing about this is that women are slightly overperforming, let's say, in terms of their LSAT scores in law school. And so they come into law school with slightly lower LSAT scores than men, slightly higher GPAs, but they are actually earning slightly higher overall law school grades than
Mm-hmm.
men. And so, what's the cost of that success? Obviously, it's coming at the cost of their own physical and perhaps mental health, because
Yeah.
they're not sleeping, they're not exercising, they're not engaged in social activities with their peers or colleagues or friends. And so, that concern that I have about women professionals seems like it's starting early, right? It's starting
Yeah.
while they're in law school, and it's evident in the data that I have from law faculty. But also, I think it's something we really need to be concerned about and be careful about with our students. And so, I've been really gratified to see the ways in which institutions and law schools specifically have been grappling with these questions. At least they're coming up as topics of conversation now, where we're asking ourselves, does it make sense to have asynchronous videos available online, even though we'd like to meet as a whole class? But if we have students who are parents, how are they supposed to manage their original class time hours if there's no childcare available, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it may not mean that everybody does asynchronous classes, but at least we're having the conversations now. We're recognizing that we need to start paying attention. Perhaps we had to long ago, but at least we're paying attention to some of these changes and challenges and thinking about ways that we can be more inclusive.
Absolutely. And one of the things that I also think is really great about, and, I don't want to essentialize in terms of, how women are and what women do, but one of the things that I have seen as a woman who has become a dean and who's had an administrative role at the law school for some time now, one is that there's this very deep commitment to community among this group, which is really wonderful. Just very supportive people who want to see other people be successful, but also within our individual institutions, I can just sort of see some of the changes that people are making. And it's everything from, one of the things that I will be proudest of when I'm no longer a dean is that we finally have a lactation room in the law school, or the fact that and I've talked about to other women deans about this as well, I bring my kids to events all of the time, right? My daughter was my date at the law review banquet last year.
I love
Um,
it.
and it's this way of sort of saying, I have a life that outside of this institution, and I don't need to be embarrassed by it, and I don't need to be ashamed of it. And it's not something that drags me down. It's another important piece of who I am. And so I hope that there are ways in which women's leadership, and not just in terms of childcare, but in terms of a whole host of different things, has a really positive impact on law school. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed on that, and we'll see what the data shows us, 5 or 10 years from now.
Well, it's very important role modeling that you're providing too. I mean, there's really no other way for your students to see that you can be a successful woman of color, to be the dean of a law school. I mean, look at you, and to have a family, right? So, like, how else would they know that if you were hiding that piece of yourself? I think, a lot of students wonder about how they can juggle their personal life and their professional life, whether and when they should have kids, how they can try to structure the work that they do in the future, right, at a firm or in government or in solo practice, how they can balance that with having a child and then raising a child. The from a recent Leslie annual report on how relationships matter, I was thrilled with this particular finding. 93% of our students know that their instructors care about their learning and success in law school.
That's great.
Which is wonderful. But if we're just sort of saying, you go, but we're not really showing them, a little bit more fully what the rest of their lives might be like, it's still maybe not enough, right? I think when we do give them a little bit more of a well-rounded perspective of some other parts of our lives, they have a little bit of a glimpse into what their future might be like. And the benefit to the students of that is that they get a chance to actually see their professors as real people.
Yeah, and that's so valuable.
It's difficult to balance all the many things in a well-rounded life, regardless of what they might be individually. So hopefully, like you said, this is an opportunity to think about a better way of doing things moving forward.
Definitely. Well, Mira, I want to thank you so much for this conversation, for taking the time to talk to me. This has been really wonderful. I also want to thank you for the work that you're doing, both the book, Unequal Profession, but also the work that you're doing, Leslie, which is a really wonderful way for those of us who are in law schools to really get a good sense of what our students are experiencing in our institution. So again, thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for your work. And I look forward to when we can actually be in the same physical space again. And hopefully we'll be able to bring you back to the law school when everything gets back to whatever the new normal is going to look like.
Well, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed this. It's been a pleasure talking with you.
Wonderful.
The Power of Attorney is produced by Rutgers Law School. With 2 locations, minutes from Philadelphia and New York City, Rutgers Law offers the prestige and reputation of a large, nationally known university with a personal, small campus experience. Learn more by visiting law.rutgers.edu.